Welcome back to Chess Dog. Today we have another game in the matchup between Alireza Firouzja and Magnus Carlsen in Banter Blitz. These are 3-minute games. As a reminder, 3 minutes for each side, sudden death. And as a result, you do get some mistakes that players of this caliber would never make. But I would say that I would love to be able to play in a 90-minute game as well as they're able to play in a 3-minute game. Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces. Firouzja has the black pieces. Let's jump right in. Carlsen begins with e4, c5, the Sicilian, knight f3, e6, and now Carlsen plays g3. And this move is a little more common when black plays e6 in a Sicilian because he can no longer keep that e4 pawn stuck in place to block the long diagonal. Knight to c6, bishop g2, knight f6, d3, and d5. And what has happened is this is transposed into a pretty orthodox King's Indian attack formation. You can also get into this type of position against a French defense or some other openings. Basically, White's playing a King's Indian defense with colors reversed. Queen to e2 to avoid the exchange of queens and also support the advance of the pawn to e5. Bishop to e7, and he goes ahead and plays e5, grabs that space. Knight to d7. So White wants to preserve this e5 pawn at all costs. Black wants to attack it and win it. That's sort of the goal. There's a lot of pressure on that square. And Carlsen plays c4. The idea behind c4 is to compromise this d5 pawn, either get it to advance or exchange itself off. And by doing so, weaken the e4 square. So White will play bishop f4 and then knight d2 e4 if allowed. So Firouzja doesn't want to do that. He wants to keep that d5 pawn right where it is. Queen to c7, cd5, ed5, knight to c3, attacking d5, and knight to b6, defending the pawn. If he advances the pawn, then just knight to d5, and White has a strong position. So Firouzja defends d5, bishop to f4, threatening e6 with some attacks on the queen. So bishop to e6 blocks the pawn. h4. Magnus continues playing in a normal King's Indian attack style. These are very thematic moves. And if Firouzja were castled short, this would be an unbelievably dangerous attack. So we'll see how Firouzja tries to avoid putting his king in harm's way. Queen to d7 helps add to the defense of d5, controls some light squares, castles. h6 to keep pieces out of g5. Queen to d2, and long castles. Firouzja, recognizing the danger, of course, to his king's side, castles long, and now we have opposite sides castling. a4 to irritate the knight at b6, and Firouzja plays a5. The downside of this move is that it weakens the b5 square. Another option was to play d4. The downside of this is that it weakens the long diagonal, but what happens after knight e4 is that Firouzja can play bishop to h3 and exchange off that dark squared bishop. So the d4 works a little bit better in this position. After a5, Carlsen does not hesitate. He pops the knight right into b5. And now Firouzja plays g5 to open up lines. Remember, we're opposite sides castling, so it's a bit of a race. So you want to get to your opponent's king faster than they can get to your king. Computers think that a more calm move like king to b8, a couple of consolidating moves, and then g5 is a bit better, but to my eyes, g5 looks very scary for White. Pawn takes, knight g5, bishop g5, bishop g5. So Firouzja gives up a very strong dark squared bishop, but he opens up the g file. It's now half open. Bishop to h3, they exchange the light squared bishops, and now f4 is what Magnus played. The downside of this move is it does expose his king quite a bit. The upside is that it keeps the e5 pawn defended. One option would be e6 to interfere with the queen and the bishop. After queen e6, rook f to e1, queen g4, then queen to f4, threatening mate on c7 and offering the exchange of queens. That would force queens off the board and leave White in pretty good shape with the two bishops. He doesn't want to just take the rook, by the way, because then bishop takes, queen h3, king f3, knight to e5 check, and White's king is about to get destroyed. But instead, Carlsen plays f4, bishop g2, queen g2, rook d to g8, attacking along the g file, bishop to f6, rook to h6, king f2, rook h to g6, doubling on that half-open g file, bishop to h4 to defend g3, king to b8, rook a to c1, attacking c5, knight to b4, threatening knight takes d3 check, forking the king and the rook. He defends with the queen, and Firouzja takes on a4. And in the game, Carlsen was really upset about this, allowing this move. Knight takes a4 really turns the tide in black's favor. His knights become extremely active. Knight to d6, knight takes b2, again threatening knight takes d3 check, winning the exchange. Rook to c3 defends d3, and now Firouzja decides to give up the rook for a knight and a pawn. That knight at d6 was a little too well placed, so he takes, and it opens up white's king a little bit more as well. Rook to b3, the knight returns back to a4. Rook to a1 hits the knight, and now he plays b5. Very active defense. Standard Firouzja protocol is to move the pawns in front of his king aggressively, and he's doing that here as well. Queen to e2, c4, continuing to use his pawns aggressively. Pawn takes, and rook to e3. But at the very least, Magnus has a chance, maybe down the e-file, to create some trouble for black's king. And here Firouzja plays knight to c5. Probably not the most accurate move. A little bit better move, as the computers show, is rook to c8. Adds to the defense of the king and also keeps the c4 pawn protected and strong, and it can advance after this move. But knight to c5, he's aiming at the d3 square, but he gives up this a5 pawn, and now the a file is open for the rook as well. Knight c to d3 check, king to f1, queen to c6 with a not so subtle threat of queen to h1, checkmate. So Carlsen has to do something about that. He plays queen to f3 to block the diagonal, and Firouzja plays knight to d5. He doesn't want to move the queen and allow queen or rook to land on a8, so he plays knight to d5, which also hits the rook at d3, and Carlsen returns the favor. Firouzja took a knight at d6 on the 6th rank for a pawn and a knight, so the exchange sacrifice is given right back. Same material discrepancy. Queen d3, knight to c7, defending b5. And at this point in this 3-minute game, Carlsen was up on time. He had maybe 30 seconds. Firouzja was around 20 seconds at this point. And here Carlsen makes a very uncharacteristic mistake. He makes a blunder here. The move he makes is king to f2. Seems safe enough. He wants to avoid black's queen becoming active by checking at h1. But this is a mistake. And can you see why this is a blunder? That's right. Firouzja plays queen to b6 check. A double attack, hitting the king and the rook at a5. And Firouzja now has a decisive material advantage. King g2, queen takes a5, bishop f6, queen to a8 check, and after a few more moves, queen to a3, rook to c8, queen f3, queen c2 check, and here Magnus resigned, being down a rook, and the king hunt is on. So this quite compelling blitz match continues against two of the best players in the world. I hope you're enjoying these games. See you again soon at Chess Dog.